So the Russian Ministry of Defense just announced that they have taken Pokrovsk and Vovchansk. Ukraine is pushing back on those claims, saying that both areas are still heavily contested, and a Russian war reporter is complaining, saying, yeah, we advanced a little, but at what cost? So let's get into it. Now, I've got Deep State map pulled up here to show a couple different areas we're going to be talking about as we get into the Russian Ministry of Defense claims that they put out on November 30th, where they cite Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov saying that the liberation of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk People's Republic as well as Volchansk in the Kharkiv region have both been accomplished. So the Vovchansk up here in the north, we'll zoom in a little bit. The border area here between Kharkiv in Ukraine and Belgorod in Russia. We'll come back to that in a second. And then the one we're going to focus on right now is down here in the south with Pokrovsk. So we have a couple different mapping services we're going to look at today between Deep State and Suryak. Now, in terms of Pokrovsk, Alexander Kotz, a Russian mill blogger, said, quote, as of today, it can be noted that Pokrovsk has completely fallen under the Russian army. Myrnohrad is still holding out. I'll turn to the map here to give you an idea of what they're talking about. We've got Pokrovsk here to the west. In fact, let's go with a satellite view. This might be a little easier to see or a little better to see. So we've got Pokrovsk here to the west, to the east a little bit, Myrnohrad. Kotz says Myrnohrad is still holding out, but its time is running out. After its liberation, the enemy will have no major populated areas on the so-called central Donbass direction. The Russian army begins the winter campaign with a major victory. Now it is time to maintain the pace. Now, look, there no doubt has been a lot of very heavy fighting over Pokrovsk for about a year and a half now, but we should also note that this is something like the 72nd largest city in Ukraine. So this marks the major victory of the Russian winter campaign. Now, Deep State map on the Ukrainian side is pushing back on these claims that all of Pokrovsk has fallen, and we see a difference here in the maps as well. On Deep State map, you'll see the red areas marked as Russian control, the gray as contested, and you'll see that a good chunk of Pokrovsk is listed as contested. That tends to be where I fall, and we'll get into that more here in a second, but if you look at the difference with how it's being reported on Suryak map, when they get down into Pokrovsk, you'll see they have the entire city as now being under Russian control, which is in line with statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, Deep State in their assessment said, quote, the enemy continues to disperse in Pokrovsk and its surroundings, trying to establish physical control in the area. The most enemy sightings are being made in the central and northern parts of the city, as fewer and fewer crews are flying into the southern part. From the side of the defense forces, attempts are continuing to clear individual areas, but the main work is being done by pilots, drone pilots, who are constantly trying to detect the enemy and destroy them. Unfortunately, we often hear cleared, but this does not solve the core problem, as the enemy has the possibility to introduce new infantry units into the cleared area. And this is why I think it's probably more, whether this ends up being entirely accurate or maybe more representative of the current fight, not just in Pokrovsk, but any major urban center that's being contested right now, is the way that Russia has carried out their tactics is through infiltration. So they send 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers at a time, and maybe they take up a position just south of the rail line here, and then they'll report up and say, hey, we're there, maybe even fly a flag, get it on video, and certain mapping services will say, great, that's now the limit of advance for the Russian armed forces. What happens after Ukraine kills that one guy? Does the map revert? It can't. I mean, it is constantly throughout the day shifting back and forth by blocks. And we have countless examples of Russian forces moving into some of these areas and then being killed. If they're followed up by Russian forces, does that mean Russia has control over the area, or is it contested? You see how it gets kind of murky when trying to figure out exactly what the frontline situation looks like in Pokrovsk. Deep State continues by saying at the same time, the area around the populated area of Rivne and along the section between Pokrovsk, zoomed in way faster than I planned here. So Rivne here to the east of Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad to the right, to the east. They said at the same time, the area around the populated area of Rivne and along the section between Pokrovsk and Krasny Liman is problematic, where the enemy is constantly being detected. The enemy sets up ambushes, bypasses the area, and even builds engineering obstacles, for example, in the form of a minefield. This complicates logistics through these areas and raises serious questions about movement in the direction of Myrnohrad. No doubt, when looking at this map, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a master strategist to say that the guys defending Myrnohrad right now are at risk of being encircled. Again, depending which mapping service you go on, they are either at risk or have already been encircled. To me, this cut off of the Ukrainian lines entirely seems a little optimistic from the Russian perspective, but nonetheless, there are active fights in Myrnohrad, and as of now, there are Ukrainian forces in that urban center. Deep State says, as the soldiers note, logistics in Myrnohrad is currently being carried out using unmanned ground vehicles and drones. Vehicles or trucks have not been used for a long time, and every physical advance to a certain point is almost 100% entering an enemy ambush and engaging in combat. In particular, the soldiers complain that in addition to their areas of responsibility, they are given the task to maintain a certain first line, which requires additional resources. Although it would be more reasonable to hand over this area to additional units that would ensure the passage of logistics and relieve other brigades of resources. They wrap up by saying the situation remains critical. The battle for Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad continues. Again, from the Russian side, they're essentially saying Pokrovsk is done. It has been taken, and we showed some footage just a moment ago, we'll show it again here, of Russian forces moving through the city center. So no doubt there are Russians in Pokrovsk. That's not really up for debate. From the Russian perspective, they're starting to look at Myrnohrad. Now it's a matter of cleaning out this pocket here. But again, from the Ukrainian side, they're saying there's still quite a bit of combat to be had in Pokrovsk. Now, turning up north to Vovchansk, we'll go back to the kind of standard overlay. It moves a little quicker on this screen. But this is the northern sector here separating Belgorod in Russia and Kharkiv in Ukraine. These red areas for about, I want to say, a year and a half at this point, have been contested, with Russian forces moving across the border and kind of establishing a bit of a bridgehead or a buffer zone. In fact, Alexander Kotz said, quote, battles for Vovchansk took place from May 2024. The Russian army has established itself on the outskirts of the city of 20,000 in the course of a new offensive in the Kharkiv region and has engaged in fierce street battles. Let me get back to the satellite view here to kind of give an idea of the city and areas in and around Vovchansk. Again, the Deep State map here. They say the Ukrainian armed forces have deployed their best units to this front line. However, the grouping of troops north was able to create an advantage in the air and push the enemy out of the buildings. The liberation of Vovchansk allows partially solving the task of creating a buffer zone between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions. The president spoke again yesterday about its relevance. The enemy will find it much more difficult to shell Belgorod with artillery and to terrorize it with drones. However, to reliably secure our territory, the front needs to move further south. They say, finally, from Vovchansk, you can advance towards Kharkiv itself. Zoom out a little bit here so you can see the area we're talking about. Kharkiv down here to the southwest. It is unlikely that we'll try to take it. However, if you get closer, artillery and drones will be able to deliver targeted strikes on deployed personnel, arsenals, and equipment storage areas. Ukrainian long-range weapons, in particular deployed HIMARS in Kharkiv, will be under threat. Now, the argument that Russia has made here over the course of the last year and a half is a buffer zone. And maybe, I'm not sure that's doing very much, to be blunt. I'm not sure what the goal of this operation would be otherwise, but we're talking about Ukrainian long-range drones that are reaching 500 kilometers. So great. Now they've been pushed back an extra 6, 7, 8 kilometers. It doesn't really have a major impact on where Ukraine is able to target inside of Russia. Again, this is the area we're looking at here, the red on the map. So if we zoom out, Ukraine still has the ability from even further east to carry out strikes into Russian territory, and certainly from even further north. So the suggestion that these couple pockets of territory are somehow preventing Ukrainian strikes in Russia, it doesn't really pass the common sense test. Now, United 24 pushes back on both of these, citing Deep State. They say a Ukrainian OSINT mapping platform reports that Russia controls only part of Pokrovsk, with large portions still contested. In Vovchansk, Ukrainian troops hold more than half of the city. That generally lines up with the Deep State map assessment here. Surprising, the Deep State analysis lines up with the Deep State map. In fact, let's go over to the Suryak map, which is going to show that all of Vovchansk is now under the control of the Russian armed forces. So this, of course, again, in line with the Russian Ministry of Defense claims here from Suryak. They say these findings match the assessment from the Institute for the Study of War and other OSINT communities, which confirm that Ukrainian forces continue active resistance measures inside all three cities, the three cities being Vovchansk, Pokrovsk, and then Huliopol a little further south. They say Deep State analysts say Russia repeats the same pattern across the front. After clearing a block or neighborhood, commanders immediately declare it captured, rotate in new units, and then lose parts of it again. The same happened in Kupiansk. a city Gerasimov claimed to have fully captured in October, despite OSINT maps showing large portions still contested. So here's Vovchansk. If we move a little east and south, we'll get over to Kupiansk to show you what that looks like. Again, another city that has been claimed a couple times by Russia as having been entirely liberated by their armed forces, but as of today, there's still contested areas throughout much of the city. So the deep state and kind of Ukrainian United 24 media point of view here is you're getting a lot of very early assessments from Russia, and when they make progress into a new area, they immediately declare that as under their control, which leads to, I mean, let's be honest, we've heard that Pokrovsk has fallen like 9 times in the last year. So it is a bit of a theme and does generally line up with what I would say are a little bit premature Russian assessments of territorial control. Now, not all Russians are happy about this. We've got our forever gloomy Igor Girkin looking at this, saying, quote, regarding the situation on the front, nothing new. Tactical successes about which I constantly ask myself, at what cost in lives do they cost us? Do not turn into a general strategic success. The front is moving very slowly westward and mainly on secondary areas and directions for the enemy. The Ukrainian armed forces do not show signs of imminent collapse, although their position and apparently the general mood as well cannot be called glorious. So I generally agree with what Girkin's saying here. We are seeing the Russian advance in multiple areas. Very slow, very costly. Again, there's been some pretty graphic footage coming out in recent days, especially around Pokrovsk, showing just fields littered with bodies. There was one picture from overhead that showed like 30 Russian bodies stacked up in a ditch a little north of Pokrovsk in the Dobropilia direction, up in here actually, where like just one after the other, after the other, after the other. There's a cost to be had there. I don't care that Russia has more personnel, more men available than Ukraine. Like it is a lot of lives being lost for what are relatively minimal gains on the battlefield. Again, looking at Pokrovsk, that Alexander Kotz talks about their major victory this winter, which is arguably still being contested. You're talking about the 72nd or 74th, maybe, largest city in all of Ukraine. So yes, advances in multiple directions. By and large, the front remains very static, essentially moving at a snail's pace. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.